friends, and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. My name's Jesse, and today we're going to be taking a look at something that can fit into just about any setting. Trees. Now, I've seen a lot of different crafting videos for trees out there. There's different kinds of trees to begin with, but there's a lot of different methods I've seen to make them, and generally, the better they look, the more complex or the more materials they use. My trees won't look as realistic, but they are very simple to make and don't require many materials. If you've ever heard in design, they say something like fast, cheap, and good, and you can pick two of those things. It's sort of like that. It's fast and cheap, you know? But I think it's good because if you want trees, you're gonna want a lot of them. You rarely find one tree in the middle of nowhere. So I feel like the easier and quicker they are to make, the more of them you can make. So having said that, let's take it away. Now, since I've actually made a few trees this way before, I'm going to skip the idea and the plan and just get right to building. The two main things I used were CDs and paper towel tubes. Now, the CDs are for the base, and normally I wouldn't use something that is not already garbage, but I have a ton of blank CDs, like more than I could ever actually use or need. So I decided to use those since they're, all a uniform size. So first I'm just cutting the tubes to get a size I want. My earlier trees were all about the same size, and this time I decided to vary it a little bit. So once the tubes are the size you want, the first step is something I actually learned from Wylock. When you're gluing a tube, or especially something like a tin can, there's not a lot of surface area for the tube to glue to the base. So what you want to do is cut foam into really little pieces and glue it on the inside of the tube. And that way when you're actually gluing, it'll make a stronger bond because there's more surface area. So I go in with hot glue and just glue all the little pieces inside the tube. Then to cover up the hole in the middle of the CD, I'm just cutting out a few little pieces of cardboard and gluing it down. I realized later on it made the tubes a little less than perpendicular. So if that's really important to you, just keep that in mind to make the little cardboard pieces smaller than the tube so they don't interfere with, where it connects. But, I was just going fast and lazy. Ultimately, it didn't hurt the final product too much, but just something to keep in mind. All right, once all the holes are covered up, it's time to attach the tubes to the CDs. And as you can see here, now that we've got the foam on the inside, there's a lot more places for the glue to go and hold on to the CD. Then I just go around the outside with the hot glue to just make the bond a little stronger. Now I take old newspaper or ads or whatever garbage paper you have, and I just crumple them up and stuff them into the tubes, mainly just for a little extra stability so the tubes aren't hollow. And then once the tube is filled with, crumpled up stuffing, I glue some more little foam bits to the top, and I take the other CD and close up the top. So now that all three trees have been enclosed, I start drawing out some root shapes. This is just to give myself a guide because I'm going to use the hot glue and just glue strings down onto the CD, and I build up a few layers of this to form the roots. And these can be as long or as short as you want. If you have a larger base, you can do longer roots. If you want them, all underground, you don't have to do any roots. I like having a few on each base just to, sell the idea of a tree better. Then you can see here I'm drawing lines on the tube to illustrate what I do next, and that is using the hot glue to make lines down the tube, and this is going to represent the bark. Now, you don't have to do perfectly straight lines, and in fact, having a little wiggly squiggliness helps because it looks more organic. If a tree bark had perfectly straight lines, that would be pretty weird. And I also drew like a little hole, like a knot in a tree, and I just avoid that area with glue so you can sort of make little adjustments however you want. And then I just have a lot of gluing to do. Once I'm done with all the hot gluing, it's time to give a base coat on the CDs because paint not stick very well to that surface. If you were doing something like chipboard or styrofoam for the bottoms and tops, you wouldn't really need a primer because paint sticks to all those pretty easily. But once I finish the CDs, time for some basing. So, I just get my normal glue and sand and cover all the bases around the roots, although you could cover them up more if you wanted. Or what I did on one of the trees was have the root stop and then reappear like it's going under the ground and coming back up. So that's just another little thing you can play around with to give some variation. And then 2 out of the 3 trees are done, so I just start painting a dark green on the top CDs because that's going to be where the leaves are. This is just so, the paint has more time to dry and I can do a few coats. Now, the good thing about having a flat tree top is that you can put figures up there if they say, climb up into the trees for whatever reason. But one of the trees I decided to do an actual 3-dimensional shape, and I'm using a variation on a method, once again, I saw from Wylock. And what I'm doing is taking a block of cheap styrofoam and I'm just breaking it up into chunks. Now, as I said earlier, since straight lines on a tree look kind of weird, I'm trying to avoid all the corner pieces, at least having them visible. So the more you break it up, the better it will look. And I'm just slowly going. I like to do a layer at a time just so I can try and minimize gaps because later on those will be hard to paint. And this is just, slowly building it up, seeing where a piece might fit best, breaking a piece up if it's not quite working, just, playing around and then hot gluing it down once it's in a good spot. And then the last thing I do is look for any significant gaps I might have missed and just try and fill them in a little bit with hot glue. Again, just to make it easier to paint later. So with that done, get back to painting. I'm just using my normal brown sand base. Before painting that, I coat the whole thing in Mod Podge to just sort of strengthen it and seal everything in so it doesn't break apart while you're painting it. Now, while that's drying, I get darker brown, my burnt umber, and I start painting the tree trunks. And then now that the base has dried, I take that same color and paint the roots. And once the Mod Podge is dry, I hit the leaves with that same dark green I used on the other two CDs. Now, I give each of those colors a few coats till I'm satisfied with how well the paint is covering everything, and then it's time to move on to dry brushing. So I take a lighter brown and dry brush onto the base. Again, this is the same, super simple brown dirt combination I do for all my bases. Just gives everything a sort of sense of uniformity. And then I take sort of a khaki tan color and I dry brush the tree bark. And this too, you can even do a few different colors to give sort of the natural color variation that trees have, but I basically, kept it simple. Now you can skip this next step, but I like to paint the tree branches, just to, sell the effect. And I want to take a quick detour here to talk about the shape of trees. And this applies to, drawing a tree two-dimensionally as well as, the three-dimensional shape. But I always find it helps to think of a tree as sort of a bundle of wires where, say you've got, 10 wires and all 10 is the trunk. And then it splits off into, say, 2 sets of 5. So you've got 2 branches, and they're still pretty thick, but they're not as big as the trunk. And then imagine each of those splits off into, say, a strand of 3, a strand of 2, some strands of 1, and then the strand of 3 breaks off into 3 more strands of 1. It's just maybe a long-winded way of explaining that the further out a branch gets, the thinner it gets. So just try and keep that in mind. Actually, as an extra helpful illustration, some people do sculpt trees out of wire. My dad actually, I remember, did some when I was younger. Now, practically, what this translates to, at least, my method, draw a wiggly line, for the branch, and then every time you make another branch coming off of it, just make the parent branch a little thicker. Hopefully that all makes sense. I think watching it kind of illustrates what I mean. And the one downside of the CDs as a treetop is that they're smaller than a real treetop might be, so the branches don't go out as wide, if that makes sense. So I sort of curve them around a little bit, maybe not 100% realistic, but I think it looks close enough. Now, when I did this technique before, I left the circle from the middle of the CD, I left that green, but I decided here to do more of a cross-section view. So I colored in the circle with a lighter khaki color to represent, the inside of a tree, as if you cut it in half and were looking straight down. But really, this is, up to your preference. You could also do like, a filled in like completely black circle to represent that like you can't move through the trunk. But it's up to you. Then I just take a lighter brown and I go over just random parts of the branches to represent some highlights. Some branches that are higher up, closer to the sun. Again, this part is completely optional, but it just adds, a little hint of realism. So once the green on the full 3D tree is done, I take a lighter green and just dry brush the entire thing. And this can be pretty heavy. You still don't want to cover it completely, but since it's the first layer, you can do a good amount. And I tried to keep more to the top half of the tree, because of sunlight, but all around is fine too. And then I took that same green and brushed some onto the sponge and sponged it on the 2 flat treetops. Now, some people dip the sponge in the paint. I don't like to do that because I find it's too thick and you have to wipe it off anyway. So I just brush it onto the sponge directly. And when you're using the sponge like this, you want to make sure that you're, rotating it around and getting different parts of the sponge, because you don't want to have like the same textured shape repeat over and over again. And, rotating it and using different parts of the sponge really helps mix that up. And this is just going to represent leaves and look pretty cool when it's done. But also, this is why I said you don't have to put too much work into the branches or do them at all, because a good portion of it gets painted over. And then I just repeat that whole process for both trees with an even lighter green. And this time, dry brush a little less on the tree, but the sponge can be about the same. And then I go through that whole process again with a yellow. Even if trees are like completely green in real life, the little bits of yellow, and you don't want to overpower it, but little bits of yellow, it really helps the colors pop. Then I just went back in over the core of the treetop, and I just painted in some little spirals to represent tree rings. Nothing fancy. So once all the painting was done, I decided to add some grass flocking. And then I decided to make this into a fruit tree. So I took out my beads and I used some silica gel beads and just glued them all around the tree. Once the glue had dried the next day, I went in and painted them all red. They can be apples. They can be, whatever color you want to represent, any round fruit or, any fantasy, imaginary fruit, whatever. Then when the grass on the base was dry, I went in and added some moss. Just to vary the foliage a little bit. And then I also added some leaves. I got this really cool leaf hole puncher from Green Stuff World, and it makes really tiny leaves. So I take some real leaves and punch out some fake leaves and glue those onto the base just for, a little more variation, a little more interest. And that's all there is to it. So let's check out the final thing. Lions, jaguars, rhinoceros. I've hunted them all. But they're not the most dangerous things out there. No, not even close. The most dangerous hunt, it's still out there. And I'm gonna find it. So, there you have it. That is my method of making simple trees. Like I said, it's really easy, so you can really crank out a bunch of them. Personally, I like doing things in batches because, especially once you're painting, you can do one, let that dry while you're working on the next one, and you can sort of get an assembly line going. Yeah, these can be good for, role-playing, if you're in a forest, or a war game. The thick base makes good, blocking line of sight. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you want to see what else we're doing, check out the links below. And until next time, be creative, be kind, take care of yourself. There you have it. Plow or something. That's my method of making easy trees. I can't say that out loud because that just sounds really silly. And